And if the settlement is going to involve land, then Zelensky's apparent position, which is that Boris Johnson's position, not an inch, is going to be an impediment. Now, it may be that's just his bargaining position, and he may be prepared to retreat from it, but he will have to retreat from it. There's no way that Ukraine is going to get Crimea back again. There are all kinds of historical arguments one way or the other about Crimea, but there's no way they're going to get Crimea back again. And as for the Donetsk, well, they'll just have to be horse trading. And I worry that Zelensky may play a little bit to the gallery with this not an inch stuff. And if he does that, what he's going to do is give Trump an excuse for siding with Putin.
Matthew, you've been writing in The Spectator that Volodymyr Zelensky is getting in the way of a resolution in Ukraine. You say he needs to get off his high horse and Europe needs to stop rewarding his intransigence. At last, something we're going to absolutely disagree on. Tell us your argument.
My argument is that there must in the end be a settlement of the Ukraine-Russian war, and the settlement will, in the end, must involve concessions on both sides, and there's no other way that this is going to stop. And many wars where we might think one side more just than the other have ended in settlements like this. And if the settlement is going to involve land, then Zelensky's apparent position, which is that Boris Johnson's position, not an inch, is going to be an impediment. Now, it may be that's just his bargaining position, and he may be prepared to retreat from it, but he will have to retreat from it. There's no way that Ukraine is going to get Crimea back again. There are all kinds of historical arguments one way or the other about Crimea, but there's no way they're going to get Crimea back again. And as for the Donetsk, well, they'll just have to be horse trading. And I worry that Zelensky may play a little bit to the gallery with this not an inch stuff. And if he does that, what he's going to do is give Trump an excuse for siding with Putin. Trump's going to be able to say, well, look, Putin and I have talked, and we are willing to talk to Zelensky about concessions, and he refuses. He's the person holding things up. And I don't think you want to play into Russia's hands like that.
Manveen, what do you think?
I think it's a really difficult question. Matthew is right. Wars only ever end with a conversation and with concessions on both sides. I think what Matthew was just saying actually points out this is such an interesting moment in history. In the past, you've always gone into one of these negotiations where it's the two leaders at the table basically having to say not an inch, because if you're conceding before you've got into the room, you're in a world of trouble. That has to be your position. And now the Donald Trump factor is so distorting that suddenly that it becomes your fault that there isn't a negotiation if you go in with what would be the standard negotiation position. And yet, funnily enough, he's not saying that to Putin. Putin has not really conceded anything, and yet that seems to be completely fine. And I think there is a huge injustice there, and it's an incredibly difficult one for anyone to have to manage. For Zelensky, I think part of this will be a positioning thing. Everyone has to say that before you go into a negotiation. I think he's been softer in the things he said on Crimea. I don't think he expects to get Crimea back. I think that will be a given. The problem is when it comes to the Donetsk, and when it comes particularly to the bits of the Donbass that have been so hard fought over and the Ukrainians have defended and are actually still defending quite successfully.
They've still got about a quarter.
They have. And to have to hand that over, I think, is not only unpalatable for Zelensky, but in his stubbornness, he represents the will of the Ukrainian people. And if you sort of replace him with a more pliant, sort of pliable leader, that will be a betrayal for the whole of Ukraine. And a bit like the morality of David Blunkett. If you are the leader going into this negotiation, you are having to weigh up the consequences of your actions for generations, centuries, if you're conceding land. And that's why I think he often hides behind the Constitution, which doesn't allow it without sort of having a huge plebiscite, effectively, having a referendum. But, if you look at the Donbass, if you just look at Donetsk, handing that over, it has one of the biggest, so far untapped reserves of gas in Europe. It would make the country incredibly rich. It would make them, you're basically risking the prosperity and security of future generations for centuries to come by handing it over too quickly because Donald Trump is making you out to be the villain. I think it's such a difficult decision to have to weigh going into this. And knowing that so many lives have already been lost, it's even harder to sell to your people that are at the end of all of that. Having had so many people killed, you've effectively given up everything they fought for willingly. I think I can't imagine that being easy for any leader.
Oh, it won't be easy for any leader. And I agree with you about the Donbass, but it's not all or nothing.
It's not all or nothing. It can't be.
There may be a halfway house, and in the end, Zelensky is going to have to soften up opinion within Ukraine for the possibility of trading a little bit of land. And I hope he knows that. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And you're quite right about sacrificing the economic possibilities of millions, generations to come. But equally, if peace fails to be found because one side or the other won't budge, you are sacrificing the lives of tens of thousands more people who are going to die in these battles.
There are softer things that could be talked about that nobody seems to be mentioning. So when this war broke out, I remember speaking to a pro-Kremlin Ukrainian oligarch, sort of off the, in a conversation that wasn't sort of
what was his name?
I'm not going to say right now, but he was very close to the Kremlin. Often did their bidding in different parts of the world, so he was an insider, and he'd had very difficult sort of conversations with them because they're about to invade his country. Which, while he supported them, he didn't want to be in the middle of a war, and he said, on this, Putin is completely intransigent. He won't give up until he has a river. He needs the Dnieper. And basically, when in 2014 they took control of Crimea, Crimea has a complete disaster when it comes to fresh water. Ironic, surrounded by water, but fresh water is incredibly difficult. They have one channel that brings it in. And because that channel comes from the Dnieper, when the Ukrainians at the end of that war, when Crimea had effectively gone to Russia, they blocked it up, they concreted it up, so no fresh water will go in. And so Putin is determined to keep going, take on not only Donetsk, but keep going on to Kherson and everything until you get to the Dnieper. Whereas actually, if you had America stepping in saying, not only will we unblock that channel, we will now protect it. We will give it American sort of protection. If anything happens to it, we will take responsibility. Yeah. There are sort of easier concessions to be made, but nobody seems to be talking about them. Instead, everybody's on maximalist. Everything must be Russian, or sovereignty is at stake.
There's also an unbalance in even when we talk about concessions, because the concessions Ukraine is being asked for is concessions on giving up stuff it has, and all Putin is being asked for is giving up stuff he wants. And it's a very different situation.
And international law doesn't play into any of that. We're effectively rewarding somebody breaking the law when it comes to taking over land that isn't yours.
Let's